Good afternoon. Let's get started. Next week, we do not have a speaker here at the symposium. That's because next week, it's the UT Energy Forum. It's a two-day event, entirely student-organized. Some of the organizers are actually in the room here. Griselda, Claire, if you need more information, you can go to them. But we will meet at the symposium in 2 weeks from now. That's 27th February. And the speaker then will be Craig Boyce. Craig is the president of the Boyce Dunham Group, and he'll talk to us on human nature in the electric grid. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, my dear colleague, David Spence, who is a professor in the McCombs School of Business. He teaches energy law, regulation, and politics. I've known David for a little over 3 years now. He's one of the guys who I really admire and really think does tremendous thinking around energy issues, really very, very meaty stuff. And I hadn't really looked at his CV up until this afternoon, and after that I admired him even more. So let me just share with you a couple of things from his CV. He has a PhD in political science from Duke University. He also holds a JD from the University of North Carolina School of Law, so PhD and a JD. He's a co-author of a textbook that is in its 3rd edition. It's on energy, economics, and the environment. He has written in almost all the top law journals in the country. He is the co-director of the Energy Management and Innovation Center at the McCombs School of Business. Before coming to the academia, David spent several years as a practicing attorney, working on different aspects of the energy industry with utility clients, with energy companies in the oil and gas business, really a lot of global companies, including Shell, ExxonMobil, BG Group, Chicago Bridge, and including some Chinese companies also, right, David? UT is not you came to Austin about 13 years ago. Since then, you have been 15 years ago. So this, as you can tell, this bio is a little couple years older. But UT is not the first place where he's teaching. He has taught at Duke, Vanderbilt, Harvard, Cornell. And it's really such a pleasure, really, to have David around. He's going to talk to us on shale gas law and regulation, both at the federal level and the state level, and how that dynamic is evolving in the U.S. David?
David? Thanks very much for that very generous and warm introduction, Varun. One of the pleasures for me over the last few years is having Varun as a client, somebody in the LBJ school who's interested in energy issues and doing interesting and exciting and topical work on energy. And we've been collaborating since that time on the Austin Electricity Conference each spring, and it's been a real joy. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy to be invited and to speak to everybody. I'm going to try and follow the prescription of finishing with at least 15 minutes left for questions and answers. I know this is an energy-savvy group. I see a lot of former students here, and I know people have a lot of interests, and there's a lot of issues associated with the topic for today. So I thought it best to just sort of introduce you to some of these legal and political issues, and then leave time for us to talk about whichever ones you're interested in at the end. So that's going to be my plan. I have a few notes here to make sure I don't forget to say anything important. You can see the title of the talk, Emerging Legal and Political Issues in Shale Oil and Gas Production. This is a topic that's, as you all know, controversial, polarizing at times, depending upon where you live. I flew in here yesterday from upstate New York, which is where I was born and raised, and if there is a ground zero for the anti-fracking movement, it's probably western New York, where I'm from. And then when I got here today and picked up my mail, I've been gone for 3 or 4 days, I found this in my mailbox. I don't know if you can see it. It says, I heart fracking. Came from, I think, a local oil and gas company. I'm not quite sure how it got there, but there's a great disparity of opinion on this issue, obviously, and I think we need to explore some of that before we can get to these legal issues that I want to talk about. And here's where I want to get to. I want to get to these issues that are sort of emerging legal issues in the regulation of fracking and the resolution of disputes over fracking. In order to get there, we have to cover some other ground first, in particular to understand the sort of politics that drives the law. Politics is a big part of how we choose, how we make policy, and so I want to get to both of these sets of issues. I've divided them into 2 categories. The top set of bullets here are really about what the policy ought to be, what risks ought to be regulated, how should we regulate them, which ones are we not doing enough on, that sort of thing. The second set of bullets are about really dispute resolution, resolving conflicts between state governments and local governments over whether and how to allow fracking within their borders, and then conflicts between local governments or state governments and property owners. These are the issues that are sort of emerging, this second set. These are the ones that are coming down the pike. These are already being addressed. Reasonable people can disagree about how well they're being addressed, but there's already a lot of action up here. These are the ones that are coming. And so I want to get to these, but in order to do that, and I think in order to really understand the context of those, of both of those sets of issues, we've got to talk a little bit about what fracking is and how the politics of fracking is shaping up. I know that a lot of you, this will be a repeat for a lot of you, but I know there are also people in the audience who don't know what fracking is. So I'll try to go through this quickly, but I hope also clearly, so we can get to the good stuff. Fracking is, of course, the injection of water and sand or proppants and chemicals underground, deep underground into rock layers, usually shale, sometimes sandstone, to fracture the rock and free up hydrocarbons that were otherwise locked in the rock, oil and gas, and natural gas liquids as well, so that those hydrocarbons can flow up through the well and be produced as a valuable resource. Right? That's what fracking is. And this figure is one that a lot of people use to sort of depict it. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see pictures of well pads during the drilling phase, and then the fracking phase, and then ultimately the production phase. So it's a process that involves a lot of water, millions of gallons of water, and chemicals sometimes mixed at the site, and then a lot of water on the back end. It produces a lot of wastewater as well. So after you shove all the water and sand and chemicals down to the ground to fracture the rock, a lot of that comes back. Everything's under pressure way down there, and so a lot of that comes back up, and what comes up with it is not only the water that you sent, some of the water that you sent down there, but also other water, wastewater, produced water that's down, salty brines that are down there deep in the ground, and those have to be disposed of. This all involves a lot of truck traffic, a lot of noise, a lot of engines, a lot of compressors, sort of the kinds of things we associate with industrial activity, and often it's done in relatively quiet, otherwise quiet parts of the world, rural areas, sometimes suburban, sometimes even urban areas. It's obviously a big deal. It's tremendous, depending on who you talk to, it's either a godsend or a scourge. I've seen both terms used to describe it. And there's a lot of strong feeling about it, and it's happening in more and more places. Those of you who are interested in the history of fracking, there are a lot of good books out on this now. One called The Frackers, which is a fairly comprehensive history of fracking. Started in, I think, at least fracking along with horizontal drilling, which these are the two technologies that when combined have created the more controversial form of the process. Started in the Barnett Shale and these shales nearby, the Haynesville, moved up to the Marcellus, the Bakken Shale, which for some reason is not, yes it is on the map. And now we're seeing it spread to other places as well. It's moving into Ohio and into central Texas and West Texas, and talking about doing it in California, Illinois, North Carolina, Maryland, New Jersey. Lots of places, Michigan, are talking about getting into oil and gas production from shales. And so it's becoming these issues grappling with under what conditions to allow fracking to occur and whether to allow fracking to occur is spreading, the fights over these issues is spreading across the country. And it's inducing strong feelings, and it's getting into the popular culture as well. And as these strong feelings are producing, pretty significant centrifugal forces in the public debate. There's a lot of polarization in the public debate. And there's a lot of attempts to frame the public debate. And so if you were to be introduced to the topic by one of these various popular culture treatments of the topic, that would help frame the issue for you. And so there's a lot of attempts to frame the issue going on, because if we can influence how the median voter thinks about the issue, we may be able to influence how politicians think about the issue and the policies they ultimately choose. So there's a pretty fierce fight going on at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, all over the producing regions of the country, or potentially producing regions of the country, to try and influence public opinion in this way. So feelings are strong. Why are they strong? Well, the benefits and the perceived risks and perceived risks are all pretty significant. You've probably read about the booms and the economic booms that are associated with shale oil and gas production in the Bakken Shale and in the Marcellus Shale. It seems every week there's another set of statistics about employment, money being made by landowners in royalties, money flowing into state coffers. There's a tremendous amount of money being made through shale oil and gas production over the last 5 years. Just to give you a few examples, I think between 2007 and 2011, employment in the United States decreased by about 4.5%. In the Bakken Shale region in western North Dakota, it went up by 35%. Pennsylvania and North Dakota both have had billions of dollars come into the state coffers. North Dakota has $1 billion surplus in the state budget, which is unheard of these days, mainly because of shale oil and gas production there. So lots and lots of money to be made, both in the private sector and in the public sector. Some local governments can reap some of these financial benefits, many cannot. Some can tax mineral resources as property, and some can levy income taxes, but most cannot. So mostly we're talking about state budgets and the private sector reaping these economic gains. And there are also secondary effects that, of course, are more difficult to measure, but are nevertheless happening. More investment in manufacturing that uses natural gas as an input, because gas has gotten so cheap as a result of the freeing up of all this gas from shale formations and so forth. There are also some environmental benefits associated with cheap gas displacing coal in the electric generation mix. Now there are fights over exactly how, what kinds of environmental benefits there are and how much, but there are some parts of this argument that aren't disputable. First of all, it is pretty clear that as gas has gotten cheaper, it has displaced coal generation in our electric generation mix. This is a figure showing percentages of electricity generated using 3 major categories of fuels. I've left out nuclear and hydro because they stayed roughly the same over this time period. And you can see that as gas has gotten cheaper with the advent of hydraulic fracturing, it has gained in the electric generation mix at the expense of coal. And so that means we're generating less electricity from coal as a result. That means that coal combustion is putting into the atmosphere fewer of the harmful pollutants that do real damage. I'm going to put aside greenhouse gases for the time being because there's an argument among scientists over whether or not there's a net plus or a net minus from increased shale gas production in terms of climate change. We can get back to that later if you want. But if you think about sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, mercury, some of the pollutants that do real harm to people, that lead to the premature deaths each year of tens of thousands of Americans just from coal combustion, those amounts are going down. And there have been some interesting analyses lately, both by health professionals and economists, trying to quantify the harm done by coal. And we seem to talk a lot about the climate change impacts of coal combustion, but we don't talk about these other impacts so much for some reason. And if you try to quantify the impacts of coal combustion, of air pollution from coal combustion, this is where the real harm is done. And so you can make an argument that at least in this category of environmental effects, there's a benefit from cheap gas that is a result of the advent of hydraulic fracturing. But what we focus on mostly are the risks, the costs of this activity, because people worry about those costs. And I've divided the risks here into 4 categories. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but in the popular discussions, especially early on in the debate over fracking, a lot of the focus was on contamination of water, both groundwater and surface water. If you saw the movie Gasland, a lot of the focus in Gasland was on contamination of groundwater and surface water. Water supply is now becoming a much bigger issue, particularly in arid parts of the country like here. Seismicity, that is earthquakes, associated with oil and gas production generally and with disposal of wastewater and underground injection wells associated with oil and gas production has become a big issue, especially here in Texas, but in other places as well, Ohio, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Air pollution risks, I talked about some of those. There are both conventional pollutants and greenhouse gases that are emitted as a result, as part of the natural gas production process. So we try to get a handle on those risks as well. And I think perhaps the most certain of all the risks, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding these other risks. We're still studying them. We're still learning a lot about them. But probably the most certain set of risks are those in the lower right-hand corner. These are the things that are going to happen if fracking comes to your town. And I'm talking about truck traffic, noise, the smells, noise, lights, deterioration of the roads, all the sort of boomtown effects, which can be good. Those can be the economic benefits we were talking about, but they can also be bad for some people, right? So if you're in Williston, North Dakota, which is one of these boomtowns, these fracking boomtowns, whose population doubled as a result of fracking, income, essentially a whole other town's worth of well-paid oil workers who have money to spend. And that drives the price of everything else up. And if you're not one of those well-paid oil workers or otherwise reaping some of the economic benefits of fracking, then you can no longer maybe afford the apartment or the piece of pie at the diner or whatever it is. Everything's more expensive. And so the boomtown effects can cut both ways as well. These are the effects that are almost certain to happen or are certain to happen. As I say, we're learning about the others, and there's a lot of study going on. There's a lot of people trying to measure and quantify these other sorts of risks. These are just logos of institutions that are publishing research on one or more of all the different categories of risk that were listed on the previous slide. Texas being one of them. We've got research here on groundwater contamination out of our Jackson School, and research on seismicity, earthquakes, and almost every impact from fracking. Somebody here at Texas is doing research on it. And so at other major academic institutions as well. The Environmental Defense Fund is undertaking a very large multi-project research program on the effects of fracking and is partnering with many of these universities. So there's a lot of effort going into trying to figure out what the risks are and how big they are. And that's what we do in universities, and that's what you do as students and faculty, is try and address this problem in a way that sort of looks at the risks in a clear-eyed way and asks, what can we do to minimize them? Are they worth it compared to the alternative? How do we balance the risks of this activity against the risks of other forms of energy production? But what a lot of other people are asking is it safe? Especially people who live in communities where fracking is going to happen or might happen or is happening. They want to know, is it safe? And that's a little bit different kind of question, right? All this work is going to help us understand what the risks are. But if you're afraid, you may not trust some of these sources. You maybe aren't gaining any of the benefits of the fracking boom. All you're facing is at least potential costs, potential risks. And so you're worried. And this sort of influences how people assimilate new information, assimilate the new scientific information that we're generating every day. There's a lot of groups out there working on helping us assimilate that information, helping us understand the issue, and a lot of them have positions, right? They want us to understand it in a certain way. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see some active energy lobby groups that are trying to influence public thinking on fracking and on the risks of fracking. So if you go to the website Energy in Depth, that's an industry website, they will, every time a new study comes out, whether it's the Texas methane leakage study or the Harvard methane leakage study, which sort of pointed in opposite directions within the last year, Energy in Depth will tell you which one is better and which one you ought to believe and which one you shouldn't believe, right? And why. The same thing with the parties on the upper right. These are groups that are against fracking. And they will react very quickly to that scientific information and try to influence our understanding of that as well. So Greenpeace, MoveOn, 350.org, Americans Against Fracking, which is an umbrella group that was started by, really the board is composed of mainly of sort of famous people Mark Ruffalo, the actor, and Josh Fox, the director of Gasland, and a few other celebrities. And then I have on the line here NRDC and Sierra Club. They're not sort of completely against fracking, but they're willing to help local communities oppose fracking. They have sort of fracking opposition toolkits that they make available to local people. And on the bottom of the slide, these are NGOs or government organizations that are taking this sort of let's work with industry and try to develop safe rules for fracking point of view. The Center for Sustainable Shale Development is a partnership between industry, state regulators, and the Environmental Defense Fund, among others. It tries to come up with sets of rules that will help us regulate these various risks effectively. So there's a variety of different approaches to sort of how we think about the issue. Some are all for it, some are all against it, and then there are others who are in between. And if you want to try to if you aspire to be somebody who's in what Michael Weber would call the rational middle on this issue, you have to fight off these efforts to sort of influence your opinion and try to look at the science as it comes out in a clear-eyed way and make your own judgment. So I want to talk about two different sort of behavioral biases that come out of the behavioral psychology research that have been fairly well established both in experimental settings and in other ways in connection with how we understand new science when it comes out, new science about risks, about environmental risks. And one of them is fairly familiar, probably you've studied it in other classes or you've encountered it in other places, and that's the confirmation bias. This is the idea that once we come to a position on something, fracking good, fracking bad, for example, we tend to assimilate new information about that subject in ways that confirm our initial belief. So if, for example, we've decided that we don't like fracking, we think it's just not worth the risks, and someone does a study that shows that the amount of methane leaking from natural gas production wells and facilities is very small, so that natural gas, as it substitutes for coal in the electric generation mix, will likely have a positive effect on our fight against climate change and against greenhouse gas emissions. It will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You might be inclined to discount the study. The Dilbert cartoon is an example of that. And we've shown, people have done sort of experiments about this, showing subjects of the experiment an expert with a CV, qualifications, and then a position, a study, a position on an issue. And they've been able to show that we tend to discount the credibility and the expertise of experts who take positions that contradict our prior positions. That's what confirmation bias is all about. And it's probably going on in connection with this issue on both sides, I would imagine. If you go to either of those, to the Energy in Depth or to the sort of corresponding websites on the other side, fairly predictable reactions to the studies depending upon what the studies say rather than the expertise or methods of the experimenters who conducted the study. Another version of this, and it's hard to separate which is going on, I mean there are two explanations for the same effect, is the idea that we assimilate new scientific information about risk in a biased way, not because we're confirming our prior belief, but because we want to believe what our people believe, the kind of person I am, the people, the groups to which I belong. We all have an important sense of a social identity. I'm an environmentalist, or I'm an oil and gas person. That's an oversimplified way of putting it, but I care about the environment. I care about economic growth. And we think about this identity. It's important to us to maintain it. And so if the people in our group, the people like me, think one way about an issue, I'm inclined to want to think that same way, to reach that same conclusion about the issue. And so I will take in new scientific information about fracking in ways that help me maintain that sense of cohesion with my group. Dan Kahan at the Yale Law School has done a set of fascinating experiments in which they give people a questionnaire and sort of separate, through the questionnaire they can determine which ones are essentially on the left part of the political spectrum and which are on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. And then they show them information about, let's say, saying that nuclear power is safe. Or they show them information that the death penalty deters crime. Right? And they ask about the experts who have reached these conclusions in their studies. They show them fake studies, essentially. And they ask them, how credible do you find this expert? And the people on the right will find the death penalty expert very credible, and the people on the left not credible. And I got my studies backwards. I should have said nuclear power is not safe. People on the left will find that expert credible, and the people on the right, that expert not credible. The same people. So we see this same phenomenon, and the people like Dan Kahan attribute this not to confirmation bias, but to the desire to want to be part of a social group, to believe the things that people like me believe. And this, I think both of these contribute to the polarization of this debate. We tend to not want to make distinctions between gas and coal and oil. We tend to think of ourselves as pro-fossil fuels or anti-fossil fuels. Industry versus the environment. It tends to contribute to the polarizing effect. The other aspect of this that helps make the debate, the public debate, polarized is the fear aspect of things. Anytime, the behavioral psychology research also shows that appealing to fear is a really powerful thing. We are wired to be aware and hyper-aware of risks. And sometimes if we are afraid of something, that fear, that emotional response will overpower the rational response. There's enormous literature on this now, and one of the authors refers to this effect in political debate as amygdala politics. The amygdala is the primitive part of the brain that contains the circuitry for emotion and fear, and through neuroscience mapping, where they watch people when they activate these fear centers of the brain, they can see the connections between the amygdala and the frontal cortex. The amygdala will dominate the frontal cortex in these situations, and so the appeal to fear can be a really powerful one. And if you combine the appeal to fear with the fact that sometimes local people really have not much to gain from allowing fracking in their town, if you're not getting the royalties, if you're not getting the jobs, some of the people aren't. For those people, it might be a fairly rational response, or it might be a fear-induced response to say no. All of which means that the debate over these new policies is extremely emotional. I said I would divide the types of new laws into two categories. The first category was regulation of risk, regulation to protect groundwater, protect surface water, protect water supply, minimize air emissions, guard against earthquakes from underground injection wells, that sort of thing. Almost all of that action is happening already. New regulations are being passed, and mostly at the state level. The federal government has not been terribly involved. The EPA has passed or has proposed one rule that will minimize air emissions from natural gas production sites, and they promised to address wastewater disposal from natural gas operations, oil and gas operations. But most of the action's happening at the state level, and every single state that has shale gas potential, shale oil and gas potential, is doing something. They're all doing something. They're either updating their existing oil and gas regulations to deal with new fracking risks, or in some cases they've created entirely new regulatory regimes. California and Illinois, for example, within the last year have passed entirely new regulatory regimes to address fracking risks. Some states have imposed a moratorium. New York has imposed what seems like an indefinite moratorium on fracking in the state. These other states in the middle here are studying the issue. They don't seem likely to follow New York's lead. They're actually trying to put together rules that they will then use to go forward, it looks like. Although in Michigan there's an effort to put on the ballot a moratorium, a referendum calling for a moratorium. So that's where this action is. I'm happy to talk during the Q&A about any of these rules, addressing any of these risks. But I wanted to get to some of the newer stuff first and make sure we get a chance to talk about that. And this is local. I really want to talk about local bans on fracking. because that seems to be where we're headed now. We have a rapidly increasing number of local jurisdictions, here's just a map of New York, who are banning the practice within their borders. And I think at last count there were a little more than 400 municipalities nationwide who had banned fracking. In Michigan and Colorado, there are petition processes underway to ban it statewide. I think we can think of New York State as almost entirely banning it anyway, because they don't seem to be inclined to allow fracking anytime soon. In this picture, the heavy black line denotes the boundary of the Marcellus Shale. The gray shaded area is the Utica Shale, which exists, I forget which one is deeper, probably someone here knows, but I don't remember. Thank you very much. One on top of the other, and so you get these interesting things like the town of Herkimer considering a ban, even though they're not in either one. The state of Vermont, for example, has imposed a ban, and they don't really have shale gas or oil. So these are more symbolic expressions, I think, than anything else. You will also see fewer, but some pro-fracking ordinances. Yeah, Carrie.
Can you just give me a definition of the difference between ban and moratorium?
Moratorium is a temporary ban. At least in this jargon, that's what we're using it that way. In the southern tier of New York, which is poorer, mainly farmers who are not doing so well, a number of towns have passed expressions of support or of welcome for hydraulic fracturing businesses. They don't mean much right now because there's a statewide moratorium. But if the statewide moratorium is ever lifted, this is where fracking is likely to happen first. These people sort of look across the border at Pennsylvania and see all the economic activity and want some of that, I guess. All right, so we have these local ordinances, and this creates two sets of new legal issues that you're going to see a lot of in the next few years. One is litigation over whether or not the state law, the state oil and gas law, which all these states had pre-existing oil and gas laws that govern permitting for oil and gas development, whether that law preempts these local bans, trumps them essentially so that they're not effective. We've seen about 9 cases so far involving local bans on fracking. Most of those cases that have been litigated so far have been in Pennsylvania and New York. There also has been one in West Virginia and one in Ohio. The way that the courts look at these are kind of a confused area of the law because you have essentially two equal forces working against each other. You have usually a state oil and gas statute that says that it's the state's job to regulate oil and gas development, implying a preemption of local law. But then you also have, in most of these states, a so-called home rule provision, which is either in the Constitution or in the statutes, a provision that says the local governments are in control of land use activity, regulating and policing land uses of land. And so the courts, when they get these preemption cases, I don't want to say they've struggled with it because they've all reached conclusions, but they don't reach the same conclusions, even though their laws look the same. So even within the state of Pennsylvania, you have a federal court deciding that a local ordinance is preempted, and you have a bunch of other state courts applying the same Pennsylvania law, saying that the local bans are not preempted. In New York, you have 2 cases upholding local ordinances that ban fracking. In Ohio and West Virginia, you have 2 cases upholding the state law, concluding that the state law does preempt the local ordinance and that fracking can go forward. Same thing in Louisiana. You don't have cases, but that's because their preemption provision in the state law is so strong that nobody even brings a suit. No one tries to ban it because it's so obvious that they'll lose. Colorado, we have 2 cases in the courts now involving Fort Collins and Longmont, Colorado, which have each imposed fracking bans, and those preemption cases are going forward. We're going to see a lot more of these. This is with 400 plus local ordinances and other people that want to frack, and sometimes it's the state agency that wants the industry to go forward. We're going to see a lot more of these cases. And so far, we're not seeing a whole lot of coherence or cohesion to the way the courts are resolving these cases. But eventually, within each state, the law will become clear. So it's entirely possible that in some states, these bans will be preempted, and in the neighboring state, they won't be even if the state laws in those two states look kind of similar, because the way the judges are applying those laws are not consistent. I wish I could say more by way of prediction, but it's really hard to predict in this area. So let's assume that in some of these cases the local ban is upheld. That triggers another set of litigation. This is the United States, so when we're mad at each other, we sue each other. And so there'll be a lot of litigation on this as well. And that's something called a regulatory taking. This is the idea that regulation has taken your land within the meaning of the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, rendered it valueless. That's essentially the equivalence of taking your land for a public highway, for example. And so therefore you're entitled to be compensated. You're entitled to just compensation for your land having been taken. We don't have any of these cases litigated yet, but they're just starting to come. There are threats of lawsuits. In fact, I'm quite certain there's going to be a lawsuit in New York on this quite soon. There are threats of this in Colorado as well. We're going to start to see a lot of property owners suing, challenging local ordinances banning fracking because they say their land has been taken. Obviously, their land hasn't been physically taken, but they're saying it's been effectively taken by these sets of rules. The courts are going to analyze these kinds of cases in one of two ways. And let me just give you sort of two different scenarios to sort of think about it. Let's assume it's the landowner, the farmer, who wants to lease his mineral rights and earn royalties from shale oil and gas production. And the farmer says, this ban on fracking has taken my land. The way that the Supreme Court has laid out the rules governing the resolution of these takings cases, these takings claims, is that they've made two different tests. They've created two different tests depending on the situation. One for when all of your property's value is gone, and one for when just some of your property's value has been taken away. Right? It's been devalued partially. In the case of the landowner who has a farm and may have other things he can do with his land, it's not a full devaluation to take his mineral rights unless we sort of separate out the mineral rights and treat them as a separate piece of property. And courts sometimes do that and sometimes don't. But let's assume they don't. In that case, it's a partial taking. And what the court will say when these cases come into the court is, we have to follow the Supreme Court's guidance, which says that we should balance three things. The importance of the governmental action, why the regulation is there in the first place, how important is that? That's number one. The size of the economic impact on the property owner, and the degree to which the new regulation, quote, defeats the reasonable investment-backed expectations of the owner, close quote. That means, could they reasonably have expected to be able to produce oil and gas on their land, and now that's been taken away? Was that a reasonable expectation to begin with, or not? That last criterion, that last part of the test, will be something that will be fought over. The pro-ordinance, anti-fracking argument will be, well, fracking is a whole different kind of thing. It's a much more disruptive process. It's kind of like a public nuisance. It's so loud and noisy and smelly and poses risk to people, and people hate it. That's kind of like a nuisance. You shouldn't have reasonably expected to be able to do that in the first place, and therefore this new rule doesn't take your land. It hasn't defeated your reasonable expectations about what you can do with the property, and therefore hasn't taken your land. The counter-argument will be, wait a minute, we've had an oil and gas regulatory program in this state forever, for a long time, and I have mineral rights that could have been produced. I should be able to be, if the state would have given me a permit, then I should have been able to produce, and you've taken my land by denying me the right to produce. So there'll be that balancing process in the case of let's say a landowner. What if the person who's complaining, who's suing, is somebody who owns just the mineral rights? They've been sold off to another person. In that case, if the only minerals that could have been produced were shale oil and gas using fracking, they can argue my land, my rights, my property rights have been completely taken away, completely devalued. In that case, the Supreme Court says it is a taking requiring compensation unless, once again, what you had planned to do amounts to a nuisance, a public nuisance. So in both cases, we're going to get into these fights over whether or not fracking is a nuisance. And I've very briefly described the impacts of fracking. We don't know how courts are going to resolve these questions. There are legal scholars who've predicted in both directions. and there are lawyers who are eager to fight this out, as there almost always are. And so we're going to have to wait and see what happens. There's going to be a lot of both of these kinds of litigation in the next 3 to 5 years. Probably a lot of it in New York, because New York doesn't seem inclined to lift their moratorium anytime soon. So even in that case, it could happen even in the towns that don't have local bans because the state has banned it. Everywhere else, it'll happen where the local bans occur. All right, so those are the sort of two types of legal issues that I see as sort of hot and active right now. I didn't get into too much detail about the new regulations, but I'd be happy to in questions and answers. And I see we're almost at 6 o'clock, so I'll stop right there and take your questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Carson is passing the mic around. Let me make a brief announcement. For students who are in the district, we have a surprise attendance sheet there, so be sure to sign up in that attendance sheet before you.
All right, what was the first question?
It's right here. Yeah. Right there.
Thank you, Dr. Spence. Great presentation. I have a question, I guess, about the eminent domain issue in Texas. Mm-hmm. There's the common carrier, I guess, has been a stumbling block where basically oil and gas companies who build pipelines have to offer a very minimum threshold of proof that they're going to offer their pipeline for other companies to use. So at this point, all they have to do is offer basically a menu of tariffs. This is how we're going to charge, but no other proof is really required. What do you see as a more solid legal basis to prove common carrier status for these pipeline companies?
So just for everybody else's edification, that's a slightly different factual situation than I was talking about, right? So that's about taking land for a pipeline, right? And the state grants to the private company the power of eminent domain, something normally that only the state would have, for operation of a pipeline if the pipeline operates as a common carrier, meaning it provides a public service to all users of the pipeline on equal terms. And there's a big case, at least one big case you may know better than I, right now alleging that some of the pipelines that have been granted eminent domain power are not actually operating as common carriers. And this becomes an issue any place you're extending new pipelines to get from new shale producing regions back to the trunk lines, right? So your question was, what do they need to do, or how can they put themselves on a better footing? So I'm only giving an opinion I'm giving an opinion from afar here. I don't know much. I have not been personally involved in any of these cases. I've just been reading about them from afar. And my sense is that some of these pipelines are vulnerable on this claim, right? That they're not actually operating as common carriers. A common carrier under federal law would mean you do have a public tariff. Anybody who wants to can schedule service over your pipeline on the same terms as anybody else. From what I read, and this is just news coverage, some of these pipelines do not do that. They essentially use the pipelines for their own gas and their own gas only and don't make the service available to everybody else. That's what common carrier means, right? And so if that's true, I would think they would be vulnerable unless Texas has some sort of statutory definition of common carrier somewhere in the rules is different from the one that everybody else uses, and I doubt they do. Yeah, sure.
I guess try to phrase a question that makes sense here. But I guess the concept of risks from oil and gas, or say any energy operations where you can sort of, I guess, rather easily make a direct tie between an activity and some kind of damage, and those in which you can't make a direct tie between some damage, and maybe in the context of eminent domain as well. So I keep thinking of we're in the drought, and maybe they haven't followed the water rights for power plants fully, and they say, no, we want power plants to have their water rights, even though it says they shouldn't, and that means we have to reduce water access to farmers who might otherwise have a water right with some sort of a taking, perhaps, as you've been discussing. So that when there's not really an environmental impact, but you can kind of see that the rule's not being followed, versus something like there's earthquakes from hydraulic fracturing and somebody's house has a crack and who's responsible for that crack in the house.
Right. So in the context of both of these sets of cases, the point I'm taking from your question is, what's the difference between risks that are some probability that something will happen and risks that we're either virtually certain will happen or already did happen, right? And in the fracking context, there's a lot of, in those other three quadrants of risks, there's a lot of debate about how big they are, right? So if the judge, for example, thinks that the risks associated with fracking and the risks to groundwater associated with fracking are, if the probability of groundwater contamination associated with a fracking in my town is quite high, that may or may not jive with the scientific record, right? So if you look at the studies on groundwater contamination, there really isn't a huge sort of strong sense of fracking causes groundwater contamination, right? There's a Duke study that shows that methane concentrations nearer natural gas production wells have higher methane concentrations than wells further away from the natural gas production well, but that didn't involve sampling beforehand, and so they haven't been able to establish a causal link. There's another study in Arkansas by the USGS that did sample before and after and found nothing, no increase in methane or fracking fluids. Nobody's found fracking fluids causing groundwater contamination as part of a study. There have been some incidents where people have alleged that, and one incident where the EPA concluded that it probably happened. But as far as the studies go, and we're trying to characterize risk, there are some risks that people think of that they're really afraid of and they think of as very real that are probably very small, right? And so if you're a judge trying to decide whether something's a nuisance, or whether it's a nuisance even if regulated by the state, which the state would do in all these cases by issuing permits and making people adhere to standards and so forth, your sense of that risk, your assessment of that risk is going to be central to your decision about whether or not it's a nuisance and therefore whether it's a taking, right? And so this gap between the popular sense and the sort of scientific debate is important, and one that we got to hope will narrow in some sense. I don't know if that was evasion or not, but
I think so, but I guess you were getting to it, like in some cases where it's not really a scientific debate, like I just saw you do that. And some where you have to debate.
Like the road, destruction of roads, let's take for example. The Eagleford roads, everyone agrees, have been destroyed by tanker trucks, tanker truck traffic, and the local governments don't have the capacity to raise the money to fix them themselves. They have to count on the state to somehow pull money from the companies and send it to the towns. And that's a very different kind of thing than the sort of assessment of a probability that we talked about before. That normally wouldn't be considered a taking because the roads are public anyway. So taking is of private property for public purpose. So we'd have to come up with something else. Maybe a sinkhole. If there was a sinkhole because of mining underneath or something like that, that might be, well, that's not going to work either.
I guess I just think about the Texas power plant, right?
The water rights, yeah.
Yeah, then why didn't you just pay them for that?
I assume that if the water rights were taken, if they weren't a taking, it wasn't considered a regulatory taking, it's probably because the water rights management regime alerted, everybody understood that under the regime, the regulator can redivert water, and so your reasonable expectations were not defeated. How about back here?
Okay. Professor Spence, thanks for the presentation. I think you have shown us the perfect heterogeneity across the regulation regimes on this issue. So my question is, using imagination, so what do you think Ronald Coase will say about this issue?
So what do I think Coase would say about this issue? Many of you probably have studied the Coase theorem and the idea that the most efficient way to resolve externality-related disputes would be through private bargaining among the parties, assuming there are no transaction costs to bargaining and everybody has perfect information, right? So it's those assumptions, that last part, that gets sticky. Even Coase himself repeatedly said that those assumptions really don't apply that often in the real world. But it's a good question, an interesting question. And at the local level, you can imagine at least attempts, not so much to promote, I mean, you can think of takings, the taking rule, the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment as a kind of way of forcing bargaining, right? If the property owner has the right to produce or the right to be compensated if you tell them not to produce, then that at least that will force bargaining in some way, right? There's a right to, but in terms of whether or not it's the efficient Coasian solution, I'm not quite so sure. But at the local level, you can imagine situations where the winners compensate the losers, right? So Pennsylvania passed a law in 2013 that was intended to sort of promote some of that. It was called Act 13. I said was because it was just struck down by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, or most of it was. But it had something called impact fees, where money that was paid to the state by gas companies would go to the towns to help them manage the impacts, like road impacts and other impacts associated with fracking. The reason it was struck down was because it was perceived by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to be heavy-handed in other ways. Basically, it preempted all local regulation, which the Supreme Court said was a violation of the Pennsylvania Constitution, which has a provision in it guaranteeing every Pennsylvanian the right to a clean environment. It's probably the only state that has a provision quite like that one, so it's not really an outcome that we can expect in other states, but it certainly has changed the way we think about these preemption disputes in Pennsylvania. But you can imagine bargaining-based solutions, or at least compensation, choose another economist, the Calder-Hicks solution, right, where the winners compensate the losers. And at the local level, you can imagine that happening. Let's say in New York, I don't mean this is a long-winded response, but in New York, let's say that over time, as we gain more information about the risks associated with fracking, more New Yorkers become less afraid of it and more desirous of the economic benefits of it. Let's just assume that. Could be wrong, and maybe we'll find out that the risks are much higher than we think they are now, but let's assume that. They might, you can imagine a situation where the politics changes and the New York comes up with a solution rather, that involves trying to help those who bear the costs of it be compensated for that. They don't have that in place now. I will say the rules that would kick in if they lifted their moratorium don't do that, but they could do that, right? And there are people who are thinking about ways to devise these kind of winners compensating the losers sorts of situations.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question. So recently there's been a lot of lawsuits in the Bakken Shale where you have mineral rights owners suing the companies for flaring gas because they're arguing that this is our resource that you are supposed to be leasing, but you're not making any money on it. I was wondering, I'm not familiar with any state laws in the Dakotas, but do they have any ground? Do you think they have a chance of actually winning those lawsuits?
So North Dakota is considered by, let's say, compared to other states, North Dakota is quite lax about this issue, about flaring. If you look at a map at night of the United States, western North Dakota looks like New York City. I mean, it looks like a megalopolis. Is that a word? It's really lit up, and that's from flaring. And it's gotten so bad that the companies, not the state of North Dakota, but the companies have gotten together and said, we really got to reduce this flaring. It's embarrassing how much flaring we're doing. So there's a push now that I believe the Center for Sustainable Shale Development is involved in coming up with better flaring rules and reducing the flaring. They flare something like 20% of the gas now, and they want to get down to 10%. But given the amount produced, it's huge. It's still huge. Most state oil and gas commissions have very limited flaring. You can only flare for a certain amount of time after the well is completed, and after which you're supposed to have built gathering lines out to that area and bring the gas in. North Dakota is more lax than other places on that. In terms of whether the royalty suits will succeed or not, I don't have enough expertise in that area to hazard a guess, but presumably whatever the property owners would be charged with knowledge of whatever the flaring rules were in North Dakota, I'm guessing.
was wondering if you could update us or comment on the so-called Halliburton rule, and just to what degree you think the industry created a problem for itself by arguably declaring itself unable to comply with the standard at the time.
You're talking about the Safe Drinking Water Act exemption? Yeah. So in 2005, in the Energy Policy Act, Congress exempted fracking from the requirement to get a permit if you to operate an underground injection well, essentially. The underground injection well permitting program under the Safe Drinking Water Act is 40 years old, something like that. And for years, companies have been operating underground injection wells to dispose of waste, and they get a permit from the EPA, or from the state is designated by the EPA to do it, but it's federal rules. And the so-called Halliburton loophole or Halliburton exception in the 2005 Energy Policy Act exempted fracking, the fracking operation itself, from the requirement to get that kind of permit. The logic was that this is not disposal. You're not going back to the well over a long period of time and redepositing or depositing more and more fluid in there. This is something different. That's the logic behind it. Whether you find that persuasive or not is up to each individual. But you don't have to get a federal permit. So it's only state permitting for operation of for fracturing and for drilling these wells and operating them. That and a few other exemptions have played into public fears, I think, or a public sense that the industry is getting away with something here. There are other exemptions as well. Hazardous waste rules exempt oil and gas wastes in a lot of ways, and a few others. And so people worry that this is not being regulated enough because of these federal exemptions from federal laws. Yeah, I think it played into public opposition. Also, the fact that they didn't have to disclose the constituents of fracking fluids, the chemicals that are in the fracking fluids, played into public opposition. A lot of that latter issue is probably not a big one anymore because most companies are now disclosing what's in the fracking fluids. There are arguments over whether they're doing it well enough, but almost every state now, the fracking fluids are disclosed. The constituents are disclosed, not the exact mixture, but what's in there. You can go to a website called fracfocus.org and pick individual wells and see the constituents of the frac fluids used in those wells now. So yeah, I think that's probably part of what people have been worried about. So, yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's really something people need to hear, and I especially appreciated what you said about bias. I think it's something people could really benefit from being aware of. So my question is, you said a moratorium is a temporary ban, at least in this context. So I was wondering, in the case of bans, since some places are banning it, or at least thinking about it, I guess in the context of, I'm just imagining like in the future, if fracking really takes off and becomes very popular, would those bans continue to hold, or is there some way they could be lifted? What would it take to lift them?
Yeah, the distinction between a moratorium and a ban is almost, I mean, it's kind of flimsy because future town councils can always repeal a ban, right? So, but technically the New York State moratorium and some local governments have what they call a moratorium pending further study. In the case of New York, it's been 4 or 5 years. All the study, pretty much all the study has been done, but the governor of New York, he's in kind of a tight spot. He's got tremendously fervent opposition in much of the state, in particularly the northern part of the Marcellus, the very northern part of the Marcellus there. And he's got his experts, his Department of Health and his Department of Environmental Conservation, saying that it's, the risks are not that high. So he's kind of between a rock. He's in this place between the expert debate and the popular debate. And they both matter, right? Because if the experts are right and you could give into the popular debate, then in the long run that could hurt you. And if you give in to the experts, you follow the experts and upset the locals, and you've hurt yourself politically that way. So the solution he's chosen is a sort of indefinite moratorium until those perspectives get closer together. I digressed and lost your question. Did I get to the answer to your question?
I was wondering specifically about bans, if because I understand that bans are, I guess, more permanent than a moratorium.
Well, yeah, they say they're permanent, but they're not really, right?
Right.
They're all enacted by political or governing organizations that could change their mind. So they're not permanent in any real sense.
Yeah, I guess I was sort of wondering, would some places, would we have some places here and there that, like, even if fracking becomes almost completely widespread, like common everywhere, like would some places continue to be almost what you call stubborn and just
Sure, I'm sure that's
even
the case.
even if
Sorry.
their own governments kind of would it
Yeah.
be hard to repeal the ban?
I'm sure that will be the case, but that's more a function of just the distribution of preferences inside the political jurisdiction. So it would be hard to imagine Ithaca, for example, lifting a ban. I mean, they're so dug in Ithaca, Tompkins County, which holds a special place in my heart. My mom grew up 20 minutes from Ithaca. I visited my grandmother. We would go to Ithaca. But the feeling there is so strong, it's hard to imagine this bias. If this bias is part of it, or if confirmation bias is correct, let's put it that way, or cultural cognition of risk is correct, it's going to be a long time before those jurisdictions ever lift a ban.
Okay, thank you.
We are out of time. Let's thank David.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any students who did not sign this yet?